Hi, welcome to Book of Mormon Digging Deeper. Today we have a special show for you. We have a guest in the studio. She's a wonderful lady. Her name is Shannon Taylor. She lives here in the Las Vegas area. She's the Relief Society president of, which ward is it?
Laurelwood Ward.
The Laurelwood Ward. And more importantly, she's the mother of 4 beautiful children who are 4 of my favorite grandchildren. So yes, Sister Taylor is my daughter. Also a student of the gospel, and turns out she's an expert on a very obscure subject that many of us have never really noticed. So just by way of introduction, I'm going to say that I believe the Come Follow Me program today this week is 90th section.
I think it's part of it. I believe we're covering sections 89 through 91.
Perfect. In the 90th section, there's a very short, brief mention of someone. And I love how the scriptures always do this, how they'll give us 2 or 3 verses on some very obscure thing and never mention it again. And almost always there's a story behind it. So, Shannon, tell us who we're going to be talking about today.
Well, first off, hi, Dad. Thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure.
I kind of want to introduce it in this way. Back in 2023, I decided I wanted to read the Doctrine and Covenants. I'll be honest, I listened to it rather than reading it. And as I'm just listening, you listen and you hear things. But when it got to section 90, I heard this woman's name mentioned, and I'm going to call her Vienna Jaques. It's spelled Jaqueus. I did find some information on her where it's pronounced Vienna Jaques. The pronunciation is pretty unclear through all the records that have been found, but I want to call her Vienna Jaques. And
I think that sounds good. That's how I have always read it.
And that's what I've always, and I may have read her name before, but I'd never heard a single thing about her. And in section 90, there are only 4 very short verses mentioned about her. And if I can I read those?
Yeah, please do. And as you're getting to do that, I believe that is the only reference to her in the scriptures.
Yep, the only reference. It's in Doctrine and Covenants, section 90, verses 28 through 31. That's it. These 4 short verses.
Let me just point out, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it not true that Vienna and Ema Smith are the only 2 women mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants?
Yep, that's true.
Yeah, okay, so tell us about Vienna.
So in a revelation given to Joseph Smith on March 8, 1833, he is told at that time about this woman, Vienna Jaques. And what it says in verse 28, it reads, "And again, verily I say unto you, it is my will that my handmaid Vienna Jaques should receive money to bear her expenses and go up unto the land of Zion. And the residue of the money may be consecrated unto me, and she be rewarded in my own due time. Verily I say unto you that it is meet in mine eyes that she should go up unto the land of Zion and receive an inheritance from the hand of the bishop, that she may settle down in peace, inasmuch as she is faithful, and not be idle in her days from thenceforth." That is it. There is no leading up to her. There is no discussion of some woman. It literally just suddenly out of the blue,
now,
part of the revelation.
Are we in Kirtland, Ohio at this time?
Kirtland, Ohio.
Okay. Well, the interesting thing to me, just as you read that, is for some reason I'm instantly drawn to thinking about Mary Whitmer,
Okay.
the mother of David and Peter and John Whitmer. She was an extraordinary woman, and not to deviate too far from our subject here, but the reason I think of Mary Whitmer is because we know she was special to the Lord, and in fact so special that she received her own personal visit from the angel Moroni and he explained that the Lord had seen her contributions in her trials and her suffering and felt that she needed a boost. Can
Yeah.
you say that?
Yeah.
In her testimony. I would have thought that that would have been something included in the Doctrine and Covenants, but it's not, and that's okay. She was a great woman. So I find it interesting here that we hear about Vienna Jaques, and there's no other ancillary history about her that's readily available.
Exactly.
But I understand that you have found a lot more about her.
I have, and I need to give credit where credit is due. I did a lot of research on her myself. However, I did stumble across a book written by Brent Rogers that ironically, so I came across Vienna in 2023, and she just made an impression on my heart. Like, it was one of those things that was like, you need to know more about this person. And I didn't do a whole lot of digging at that time. But at the same time in 2023, this gentleman, Brent M. Rogers, he had actually learned about her. He was one of the co-authors of the Joseph Smith papers.
Oh, okay.
And I think it said 2012 or 2013. I think he was working on volume 4 of the Joseph Smith papers. And
Well,
he
that's a
came
good
across
resume.
her. Yeah. And he came across her name and he wanted to know more. And so he started doing a whole bunch of research. And I'll be honest, that's where I found a lot of my information is from his book. But he wrote a book, I think it was 2023, that he felt a very strong impression that he needed to write her story as a biography. So here I come across her in January of 2023. She makes an impression on my heart. My life, I'm not great at research, but I didn't dig deeper. He came across her 10 years earlier. And in that same year, 2023, he felt a strong impression to write the book.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. And the book is called The Lord Spoke Her Name by Brent M. Rogers. And he did a lot of research on her. And so that's where I got a lot of my information. And the more I read about her, the more she just impresses me. And I think I shared with you that I believe she is the most significant background character I've ever come across in any story in my life. Like, she was nobody significant. She was nobody's wife. She was not a Relief Society president. She wasn't the sister of anybody special and significant. She just was this incredible woman of faith who, once the Spirit touched her heart, that was it. Through reading her story, one of the things that, besides the fact that she's just an incredible, incredible woman of faith, and being a Relief Society president and having the love for the sisters that I have in my ward that came to me about a month after my calling, very overwhelmingly, the impression that's kind of been made to me in learning all this about her life is that no one is insignificant, and every person, no matter what you do in your life, matters to the Lord. And your seemingly teeny tiny contributions to your life, the life of people around you, the world, can make an enormous impact, even though you may not see it. And it's kind of, you and I have talked about how, people become famous after they're dead. Lots of people become mostly famous after they're dead. But during their lives, they're nobody. And Vienna did some really incredible things that I'm shocked she's not mentioned and brought up more. And we'll talk about that as we get further into this. But it's just, again, it's proof that you don't have to be any kind of an auxiliary president or even in the presidency. You don't have to be a general authority. You can just be a human being, a child of God, walking through this life and be part of miracles and amazing things.
On social media, there's quite a few inspirational clips on TikTok and Instagram of the general authorities, local clips, especially Elder Holland.
I love President
He really
Holland.
must have a good or a social media
Yeah.
advisor. But anyway, one of the messages that I hear over and over from them, it's twofold. One is the Lord knows your name.
Yes, he does.
And secondly, that you do not have to be a general authority to be in the Lord's favor, which is something very comforting because very few of us are. Certainly I'm not. I'm just a guy. In fact, this podcast that we do isn't even a calling or anything. It's just something that I felt compelled to do based on my love for the Lord and my love of the gospel and my love of the Book of Mormon. And I know that's how you feel too. Anyway, I'm I'm inspired by your interest in her, and I think I'm safe to say that the impression you got back a couple years ago is probably more than just some random thing. And I'm glad we get a chance to present to the world the story of Vienna Jaques. So I'm very excited about this. I love the obscure things that we find in the
Yes,
scriptures,
I
and
agree.
this is one of those things. So tell me more about her. Where did she come from?
So it's interesting because there's not much known about her life in the first 40 years of her life. So we do know she was born on June 10th in 1787 in Beverly, Massachusetts. My
Wow.
understanding is Beverly is about 20 miles, I believe, north of Boston. And she is the oldest of the siblings of her, the oldest of the children in her family. And I think there were 6. She was born to Henry and Lucinda Jaques. We don't know a whole heck of a lot about them. We know that they moved closer to Boston, I believe. Vienna, however, what we do know about that time is that she was a nurse, she was a midwife, and she was a launderer. She did not get married.
No, well,
We'll get to that one.
Okay, all right.
Not never, but at that time, by the time she found the Book of Mormon, she had not been married, and she was 40 or 41, I believe. And so she, all we know is that she worked hard. And there is a mention that she got some money from her parents upon their passing. She and her siblings did. But the short story is what we do know about her in the first 40 years of her life is she was very successful in terms of the world. She was quite wealthy. She had a home in Boston, Massachusetts, and she had a home in Providence, Rhode Island. And she turned them into, what do they call them? Basically bed and breakfasts. I can only think of hostels and brothels, and I know it's not either of those. Boarding houses.
Boarding houses.
She turned both of her homes into boarding houses. So in addition to being a nurse, a midwife, a launderer, she also was making money on boarding houses.
She was an entrepreneur.
Yeah, very much so,
cool.
as a single woman.
You know, let me just say something real quick. You said 1787
was when she was born.
Do you know when George Washington became president?
Wasn't it
1789.
89.
So Vienna Jaques goes back to the Treaty of the United States signed with France wasn't signed till 1783. So Vienna is right there at the beginning of this country.
I actually thought about that, especially with the musical Hamilton being as popular as it was. She was alive when he was doing all of his
Isn't that
stuff.
amazing?
She was almost 20 when he was killed in 1805.
Wow, that's amazing.
So, and 1805 is when Joseph Smith was born.
Yeah.
So just that's some of the fascinating things, how all these things, and she was part of it. She was in Boston. You know, I don't remember, when was the Boston Tea Party?
That was a little bit earlier. I'd have to find that out, but
but she lived in Boston. So, and where all the beginnings of the country were really happening. Around 1830 is when life became easier for single women to be in the workforce. Single women could get jobs, they could go out and do things. They earned about 1/4 to 1/2 of what men were doing for the same job, but at least they could go out and do something. Well, Vienna, it sounds like her parents passed away and left her a little bit of money. And so in 1829, she bought her first house in Boston. And at that time, she was a nurse, a midwife, and a launderer. But she turned that house into a boarding house. And people would come and rent rooms. There were some that came and you could say they lived there. They were there for so long. But she was so successful in her job. She usually worked 2 to 3 jobs at a time, as well as the boarding house, that she then went down to Providence, Rhode Island, and bought a second home and did boarding houses there as well. Wow. She almost always worked 2 to 3 jobs at a time while taking care of both of these homes. So she was a very hardworking, industrial, self-reliant woman. And it does say her mother was a launderer also. And so it's assumed, again, there isn't much written about her life before she came into the church, but that she learned to work hard and be industrious from her parents, from her working side by side with her mom.
You say launderer. Today we think you're just throwing a bunch of clothes in a tumbler.
Mm-hmm.
But no, that was by hand washing those clothes.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah. And they made a living off of that.
You couldn't afford to have a husband or kids.
Right.
No time to do any of it.
Right. But the other thing is she was raised very religious. She was a very spiritual person, always had been. And she went to a Methodist church regularly. She usually was quite disappointed with her Methodist religion and her upbringing because they talked about the miracles and the healings and all of this stuff, but they never really did them. They talked about how great they would be, and they talked about that they could happen, but it never really happened. And she was always looking for more of a church that fell in line with the way that it was when Christ walked the earth. She'd read the Bible. She knew the Bible. She wanted something closer to that. But she wanted to be spiritual. She wanted to be at church. So she went every week. Well, around 1831, she read a newspaper article about the LDS Church and about the Mormons and this golden book of Revelations that had been translated. And she wanted to know more. And so she traveled to get a Book of Mormon. And when she first got it, she just kind of flipped through it and was like, okay, whatever, like a lot of people might have a tendency to do. And she put it down. Well,
Was she still back in Providence at this time?
She's still back in Boston. Yep.
Oh, Boston. Okay.
Yep, in Boston. And sometime later, not sure how much longer, it seems like it was a very short time. Like in the research that I've read, it seems like it was maybe a month at the most. She just had a really strong impression to pick up the book again. And so this time, she'd read the articles about the Mormons, she'd read about Joseph Smith and the encouragement to pray about Scripture. And so when she went to pick up the Book of Mormon, she prayed first, read the Book of Mormon, and then prayed again. And the promise of Moroni is real. We know that the promise of Moroni is real. But after she earnestly read the book and prayed about it, she had a vision of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. I don't know what was in that vision. I don't know that it's written down necessarily anywhere. Brent didn't mention anything in the book about the context of the vision, just that she had a vision of the Book of Mormon.
And she claimed it was a vision rather than burning of the breast.
Yep, it was a vision of the Book of Mormon.
Wow.
And it was from that moment forward, she was hooked and she wanted to know more. Now, she didn't get baptized right then. She wanted to know more. And so she went by herself to Kirtland to meet Joseph Smith. And she spent about 6 weeks of the summer of 1831 getting to meet the saints in Kirtland, Ohio.
Wow.
And while she was there, she must not have been there too long, but she was convinced enough. And on July 12th of 1831, she was baptized by Ema Harris.
Yeah,
Ema Harris,
yeah.
Who's Martin Harris's brother.
That's right.
And so she was baptized by him. And she did get to meet Joseph Smith before she went back to Boston. And on her way back to Boston from that time in Kirtland, she was actually interviewed by 2 different reporters, and articles were published about her and her journey to and from Boston to Kirtland and back, and her time with the Mormons and her joining the church. And so she was in 2 newspapers at that time, just this random woman.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and again, she wasn't a significant member of society in Boston that there's any historical records of her. She just was this great woman of faith, and when she had set her mind to something, she did it.
I was just in Boston last week. Mm-hmm. It's a long way from Boston, even to Cleveland, which is on the south bank of Lake Erie, mm-hmm. for people that don't know. And Kirtland is just a little bit to the east of that. That's a long way.
Yeah.
And in those days, traveling was so tough. And to get there just to meet a guy and see a book, that's pretty impressive.
It is. It's really impressive. Well, and with her traveling back and meeting those 2 reporters, she talked about how in her Methodist faith, one of the things were that it was lacking prophetic direction and healings.
That the church was.
The Methodist church was. And the reporters put that in the articles they wrote about her. They kind of mocked her because of it. Yeah, they did.
Huh.
But those things didn't bother her. She was so confident in her faith. In fact, she took a bunch of Book of Mormons with her back to Boston and started handing them out.
She went back to Boston.
Yes, she went back to Boston. And she started handing out Book of Mormons and being a missionary all around Boston. So in January of 1832 is when Joseph Smith received the revelation that he needed to send missionaries to the East Coast, to Boston. And Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith were two of the missionaries that went back there. And as they were teaching and preaching, they were coming across people who told them, oh, Vienna Jaques told me about this. Oh, Vienna
Really?
Jaques gave me a Book of Mormon. Yeah.
So she was laying all the groundwork for
She
the
was
church.
laying all the groundwork, yep. And 25 new converts, mostly women from Boston, joined the church in Boston, and mostly because of Vienna. And she helped establish the first branch that was there.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What's amazing to me is that she went back. Of course, she had business interests. She had those homes.
Mm-hmm.
She probably had quite a financial incentive to
She
go
did.
back. But even still, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Because the early history of the church, most people who gathered and stayed,
Mm-hmm.
or apostatized and left. But for her to go back home and then start a church there, that's pretty extraordinary.
It was. And that fire that lit inside her seemed to just burn so bright. She shared the gospel with pretty much everybody she came in contact with.
Wow.
And gave Book of Mormons out. She did it, all the people that would come stay at her boarding house, she would talk about the gospel. She would talk about Joseph Smith. She'd talk about the Book of Mormon. And that's how a lot of these converts, it made it easy for Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith to some degree, because they would find these people that she had already spoken to. And so they were like, okay, we'll do the ordinance side, right?
Wow, how cool.
But she did also do it in Rhode Island. She went to Rhode Island and passed out Book of Mormons and talked about the gospel there. They found more people ready for baptism and baptized people in Providence. She did actually, I believe her father had passed away, but she brought her mother and her sister into the gospel as well. And there's a cool story about, well, I don't know if I want to say cool story, but the story about her sister Harriet. Her sister Harriet, younger sister, was married to an incredibly abusive man, emotionally, physically, you name it. And at that time, when you were married, there was no divorce. You didn't get to be divorced. You stayed married. You endured through it.
And you didn't have much protection from like
No.
local authorities or anything.
No, you did not. And in fact, when Vienna introduced her sister Harriet to Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith, they encouraged her to make it work with her husband. They were like, no, you're married to him. You have a son. You need to stay married. But as they witnessed things, they actually were like, okay, Vienna, you need to take your sister and you guys need to get to Kirtland. And so they, for lack of a better term, helped her escape. I don't know how much they helped her, but by the middle of 1832, Vienna took her sister to Kirtland. And I believe at that time, I don't believe she had fully left Boston yet, but she got her sister and her nephew to Kirtland.
Right at the beginning, we read the verses about Vienna Jaques.
Correct.
But for the benefit of our listeners and for me,
I know.
When was that revelation?
March
again?
8th of 1833.
Of 1833.
Correct.
So there's still another year's worth of activity before we get to Revelation. And we're going to have to read the Revelation again because now that we're hearing this story, I want to hear the Lord's response to that.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
which I'm good with that because, like I said, when I looked up information about Vienna, and I don't want to give a spoiler away, but when I came across her in January of 2023, I found one short little thing about her that was very minor, that when we consider Sister Whitmer being visited by the angel Moroni and getting to, did she see the plates or did she see them?
It was right there in the corner. She left her home. She left the house. She was walking across the little dirt courtyard there to the barn to milk the cows. And Moroni was standing there in the courtyard, dressed like an old farmer, which is really cool. It's part of another story that I've told on previous episodes, where he just looked like a guy walking down the street, sweating and wiping his brow. But he stopped her out there and showed her the plates.
Yeah.
She's the only, technically, she's the only woman to have seen the plates.
Because Ema saw it covered, right?
Ema saw it covered, and Ema admitted that she would kind of like run her fingers up the corners of the plates on the sheet. And if I can speak honestly, this isn't church doctrine or church history, and it sounds very sexist, but she was a woman. She was a wife. She sat next to Joseph Smith for months on end while this was going on, and she had to look at some point. She moved the plates to clean around them, and I'm okay with that.
I am too.
I'm perfectly fine with that. I would have had to look too, I think, so that's okay. But officially, Mary Whitmer was the only woman to have an angelic visitation, because in truth, Emma had so many other amazing verifications of it. So, and the Lord just wanted to be fair. But
anyway, but in 1832, when she introduced her sister to the gospel, and she accepted, and they were like, "You've got to get out of the situation." At that time, Vienna, it's assumed, it's not necessarily for sure, but because of what happens next, it's assumed that Vienna sold everything. She sold both of her homes in Boston and Rhode Island to pay for and support them in their trek to Kirtland, and then in their time in Kirtland. And that was in the summer of 1832. So when Vienna got there and saw Joseph Smith again, remember, she met him back in 1831 when she went the first time and got baptized. But when she got back in 1832, Joseph Smith actually gave her an original copy, an 1830 copy of the Book of Mormon that he wrote a message to her in the front of. And that Book of Mormon she kept with her for the rest of her life. She got many other Book of Mormons. Obviously, she would pass them out everywhere. But she kept that one with her as a very prized possession, a treasure in her life for the rest of her life. I can't.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
I can't imagine having a Book of Mormon signed by the prophet. But with Vienna liquidating all of her assets, again, she was quite well off, based on the wealth that she'd accumulated. Well, in that same summer of 1832 is when Joseph Smith talked about how they wanted to build this house unto the Lord, the Kirtland Temple, so that they could worship the Lord in his house. The problem at that time was nobody else had the money to do it. Nobody had the money to secure the land. It is said that Vienna gave about $1,400, $1,500 to the church to purchase the land, which I believe they said is equivalent to about $50,000 in 2023. So she gave the church a significant amount of money to purchase the land on which the Kirtland Temple was built. So she was very significant in that.
So she made that happen.
She made that happen. She had the money.
Wow.
Yeah. So like I'm saying, when I researched about her very, very mildly, all I read about was her gathering papers. And again, we'll get to that. That's all I found.
Can I just interrupt here?
Please.
It's so interesting, and I know this has been an issue that has bothered some saints. If the Lord made the great effort to appear to Joseph Smith, and Moroni brought the golden plates and the effort to translate, every bit of it was done under the umbrella of persecution and opposition and hatred from everybody else, which I guess makes sense, that Satan would try to oppose the work as greatly as he could. But you would think that means would have been, should I say, more easily provided if you're doing the Lord's work. And in fact, it wasn't. Every single bit of it was a struggle, and every single great thing the church did hung on the very edge of being a failure. If you read Richard L. Bushman's book, Joseph Smith, The Rough Stone Rolling, you realize it was so tough. And I bring that up because I was just talking a couple of weeks ago, that podcast, 80% Nephite, 20% Lamanite. And how much do we think we're like Nephites, and yet how much faith would we have? And to join this little cultish band, if you will, of saints in Ohio, and to basically give a tremendous amount of money to build a building, you would think, well, if the Lord wanted the building built, he'd provide the means. Yep. And then the Lord saying, well, you're the means.
Yeah.
But I mean, it took tremendous sacrifice to get anything done in the church. And I wonder, I'm grateful that we don't seem to have that level of sacrifice asked of us today. But it highlights the temple covenant of the consecration. And these people were amazing. And I have said over and over in various podcast episodes, I am constantly overwhelmed by the level of sacrifice that early saints made. And I've made the point over and over in my podcast that we need to be very careful before we judge any of them, including the ones who left, including Sidney Rigdon especially. What an extraordinary man he was. But not just him, but every one of them. Those who left the church often had good reasons and tremendous social pressures and family pressures and financial pressures, and it was tough. But I do believe that the Lord has recognized the sacrifice of all of them, and I think we should be very careful before we, I don't know, condemn them to the celestial kingdom.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I agree.
I don't believe that's going to happen at all.
I don't
Because
either.
it took their sacrifice to make the work happen. And what happened to them afterwards, well, that's between them and the Lord.
Yep.
Anyway, so Vienna Jaques comes in, she makes the Kirtland Temple happen. That's
She does.
Pretty cool.
And it doesn't sound like she was asked. It doesn't sound anything like that. It just sounds like she knew, Joseph talked about the temple needing to be built. And he did talk, I'm sure he mentioned, the financial struggles, if anybody was willing, maybe he put that out there. And she stepped up and gave the money. But it wasn't with any fanfare either.
Now, did she start building boarding houses and stuff in Kirtland too?
No.
Now, does it show anything about what she did?
She just
for her support
continued
after
to be
that?
a nurse, continued to be a midwife, continued to help teach. She took care of the saints there. There's a lot about her being a nurse and caring for many of the ill, because there was a lot going on. People leaving their homes to move to Kirtland, and then they were building a community there, so they didn't have much to start out with.
Okay, so if you would, let's go back and read that part of the 90th section of Doctrine and Covenants again. Now that we've got this framework, because she sounds like an extraordinary lady, and now having discussed just this much so far, I want to.
Well, this is actually where the revelation comes in, is because by giving that money and providing that for the building up of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the building of the Kirtland Temple, she really proved the worth of women in the early days and in the growth of the church. They did a lot. We've heard the stories all the time about the women who gave up their china for the Nauvoo temple, right?
Yeah.
Like women
watched, and it had to be hard watching them bust it up, grind it up, just so it'd be sparkly in the plaster.
Exactly. And so, but she contributed this money and this revelation. So that was around 1832, summer of 1832, right? So March 1833 that this revelation in section 90 is given. And I'll read it to you again. Again, it's section 90, verses 28 through 31. And it says, "And again, verily I say unto you," and this is obviously the Savior speaking to Joseph Smith, revelation given to Joseph Smith. "And again, verily I say unto you, it is my will that my handmaid Vienna Jaques should receive money to bear her expenses and go up unto the land of Zion." Let me pause for just half a second. Being a woman in the gospel, knowing of the love that Heavenly Father has for me, I know He loves me. He has shown me so many times how much He loves me, and He loves people in my life, and He loves us all. But to be called my handmaid by Heavenly Father,
wow,
I just think is really incredible. So, excuse my emotion.
That's sweet. Well, and to consider that she gave so generously to create the Kirtland Temple, then to say she should receive money to bear her expenses. Yeah. This shows, this borders on the story of the widow's mite.
Yes.
In the Bible, where she only had 2 mites and gave all that she had, as opposed to being wealthy and giving some. Martin Harris's contribution to publish the Book of Mormon was also extraordinary. $3,500 in those days. That's a tremendous amount of money.
Yeah.
And he had to mortgage a fair part of his farm, which ultimately he lost later on. And that was a contribution that has earned him, I think, the greatest blessings in heaven. But here for her, to have to, I guess it sounds almost to become destitute, if you will.
And she did.
The church had to give her money to bear her expenses to go up to Missouri, the land of Zion, Independence.
Yep.
And then it also says, she'll be rewarded in mine own due time.
Yeah.
But she should go to Zion and receive an inheritance from the hand of the bishop.
Yep.
And I'm assuming that would have had to have been land.
Well, and that it goes on that she may settle down in peace, inasmuch as she is faithful and not be idle in her days henceforth. As we go through the rest of her story, you'll see that it was not peaceful for a long time. She got to Zion, it was not peaceful. She got to Nauvoo, it was not peaceful. So, while this is another thing that shows how God knows more than we do. If anybody argues with that, then you're on your own. But he knows that she will settle down in peace inasmuch as she is faithful. And we think about, at that time, Zion was Missouri. We're going to get to Missouri and that's Zion and things will be great.
That's right.
And it was awful. It was awful.
It was.
And then they kept being driven west and it was still awful. And we know it wasn't until they reached the Salt Lake Valley that they got a little bit of reprieve.
A little bit. And even there it was tough.
Exactly.
I don't want to jump ahead here, but did she make it to Nauvoo?
Yes. I'll go through all of the places she got to. She made it to Salt Lake.
She made it to Salt Lake. Wow.
She made it to Salt Lake. Yep. In fact, her gravestone is in Salt Lake, and my next trip up there, I'm going to go see it.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. But it's important to note that this revelation was given on March 8, 1833, about Vienna. Okay?
Yeah.
Because on April 30th, 1833.
So a month and a half later.
No, a month and a half later, excuse me, yes. A meeting of the high priests got together and they were discussing the temple and discussing church matters. And they specifically discussed Vienna's journey to Zion and how they wanted her to go with William Hobarts to go to Zion. They didn't want her to go on her own. They wanted her to be escorted, for lack of a better term. She was incredibly independent. She made it there on her own originally.
She made it from Rhode Island to Kirtland on her own.
Exactly.
And back.
And then back again. Now with her sister the second time. So 2 women traveling with a child. But this time they're like, okay, wait, we've received this revelation. She needs to be protected and watched over. We want her to go with William Hobarts. Well, the interesting thing about that, and again, this is where God he really is in every moment of our lives if we're willing to see it. So they asked her to wait so that she could go with him. And when they journeyed, he actually got very sick. And so she took care of him.
She was a nurse.
On the journey. Yeah. So she cared for him to get to Zion.
Wow.
As he escorted her.
Gee whiz.
Yeah. So these incredible, and they're seemingly so insignificant. But when you look back over everything, all of these things just add up to this incredible story. But when you're living your everyday life, you don't see any of that.
Man, again, I would like to think that I could have been a good, strong, faithful elder in the church in 1830 and 1835 and 1840. And I get uncomfortable realizing that that's a lot of work and huge sacrifices. And I hope that in the moment I could have mustered that strength. But I'm so selfishly glad that I live today in a comfortable place, in a comfortable city, and I can go to the store right around the corner, and life's really pretty good. And I hope that none of us forget that.
Yeah. Well, let's take into account that you and I live about a 25-minute drive apart. 25-minute drive is no big deal. But if we were back then, I'd probably rarely ever see you.
Yeah, 20 miles, that was a big trip.
Yeah.
That's a day's journey.
It would be like I'd come see you at the holidays.
An uncomfortable day's journey.
Yeah.
So, wow, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
I think too of the apostles responding to Satan when he says, "Do you have money?" And they say we have sufficient for our needs. And then I consider, like just in her days, 1830s, wonder what sufficient for my needs was.
Yeah.
And then I look at what we have today, and I'm embarrassed by the embarrassment of riches that we have.
Yeah.
But in any event, the Lord knows us. He knows our time and our situation. And so I guess you do the best you can in the setting in which you find yourselves.
Yep.
And I've often thought of this. I don't mean to range far afield from our discussion, but I've often thought about just speaking of inhabitants of the earth. Every prophet who got an apocalyptic vision was shown all the inhabitants of the earth from the beginning to the end. Talking billions of people. And of those billions of people, how many of them lived in caves or lived in tents or in mud huts? and had to go to a river or a spring to find water, and then you get into the 1800s or 1800s in Europe and America, and it's semi-civilized homes and streets and cities. But then you look at the advancement during the 1800s and certainly the 1900s. I was born right smack in the middle of the 1900s. And you look at what we have today and you say, it doesn't seem fair.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem fair that somebody lived in 1600 Massachusetts, as a pilgrim. But one thing that I've learned, and I've mentioned this before in episodes too, is that no matter where you find yourself, no matter what circumstance you're in, you always have the ability to prove your integrity, your valor, your worth, your righteousness. And really, in the end, that's all that we need to prove to the Lord, is our compassion, our integrity, our valor, our faithfulness, and I guess you could say all of the qualities that King Benjamin laid out. And it doesn't matter in what setting that is. And we certainly know of many very, very, very wealthy people who are very miserable people.
Yeah.
I've heard, I've heard people talk about billionaires who are miserable.
Yeah.
I can't comprehend that. So I guess the challenge in life has nothing to do with where you live or where you sleep or what you eat, but how you are in that setting.
And I think you're right, because there are people who today whine and cry over what they don't have. And yet you look at, they're living in their own house. They have their own car. They have a job. They have
air conditioning.
They have food in their refrigerator. It may not be a ton, but they
have
we're
that. Sitting here in Las Vegas where it's to be 111 today. So
yeah, but yet we're sitting in an air-conditioned room with a fan.
I was talking just the other day with your mother about the people who lived in tents in Boulder City while they were building the Hoover Dam.
Yeah.
Living in tents, and it's 115 degrees.
And those are all sacrifices.
Yeah, so we are blessed beyond our merit to every measure. So I'm grateful for those blessings.
Me too.
Anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack you.
No, you're good. Those are important points.
But I think the Vienna Jaques and the sacrifice, just getting to independence from Kirtland.
So I want to give this little timeline, because I feel like this is a very significant, because now we're getting to the point of when I came across her, when I did my little research, this is all I found out about her. So we're getting to that point. So let me just point out again that she arrived in Kirtland in around summer of 1832. March 18th of 1833 is when Joseph Smith had the revelation about her, that she's going to be taken care of and gets to go to Zion and live in peace. April 30th of 1833 is when the high priests meet and they say, okay, Vienna gets to go, but we want her to go with William Hobarts. She waits a little bit, goes with him, takes care of him. They arrive in Jackson County, Missouri, June 7th of 1833.
So that was a little over a month-long journey.
Yeah.
Wow.
But here's why it gets significant, because this is why I found information on Vienna. In July of 1833 is when the saints in Jackson County, Missouri were harassed, where the mob came out. And during that time is when they destroyed the printing house. The Edward Partridge, not Edward Partridge. Who owned the printing house? I don't remember his name.
Was it William Phelps?
I think so. William W. Phelps.
W. Phelps?
Maybe. The mob came to run the saints out because the saints were welcoming of any, as they said, free black people. They didn't want slavery, and they said any of the people who have been freed want a safe place to stay. You can come here and be with us, and we will let you live your life.
Yes, I was reading on this. This was the thrust of the persecution among the people in Missouri against the saints. It was twofold. It was this issue with the blacks. That Joseph Smith did not believe in slavery. He wanted it abolished. And then also the embracing of the Indians.
Yes,
the Lamanite people. The very first missionaries were sent to the Lamanites in Missouri. And they were very well received, and it was government agents who forced the missionaries to stop teaching the Indians. I mean, just terrible stuff that was going on. But it was that embracing of the Indians and the blacks that just got the people of Missouri riled up
Yeah.
so badly. So in the end, it was politics. Isn't that interesting?
It
More than theology, it was politics, which is the same as with Jesus Christ.
Yep.
You remember Caiaphas is meeting with the people, and they say, hey, if we don't get a handle on this guy, all the people are going to start following him. And he said, and then Rome will send their soldiers, because they had this very tenuous agreement with Rome that they could govern themselves as long as they behaved, and Jesus was a rebel stirring all that up. Well, here you have Joseph Smith and the saints saying, we just believe in the dignity of people, and the Indians are people, and the blacks are people, and we want to embrace all of them. And the people of Missouri said, no, we're not having any of that.
Yep. Well, in fact, we'll get on to see about the good things they did for the Indian people in Utah. We'll get into that in a little bit too. But I remember as a child in primary, and I'm sure every primary children's heard this, and maybe when I bring it up, it will ring a bell because I didn't remember it until I read about this. But in primary, I learned about these two little girls, Mary and Caroline, who at the time that the mob came to run the saints out of Jackson County, they destroyed the printing press, and the book of Revelations.
The Book of Commandments was the very first title, I think.
Book of Commandments?
When Phelps first printed it.
Okay. Those, as they tore apart the printing press, like literally tore the roof off, threw it down, the pages were scattered. And these two little girls, Mary and Caroline, ran to collect as many pages as they could, and then ran into a nearby field and just laid down flat so that nobody could find them.
Really?
And as I read about this, I remember that story being taught to me about Mary and Caroline. Well, what I found when I researched Vienna Jaques the first time is that she, as a 40 whatever year old woman, was out in the street collecting the pages as well.
Really?
Yes. And that is
cool.
That is all I found about her originally. And as she's collecting the pages, one of the mobsters stood over her and he said,
really?
Yeah, he said, this is just the beginning of what you guys are all going to have to endure. Said some other pretty terrible things to her, left her very, very scared. But she's still collecting the books. And he didn't, as far as I'm aware, he did not hurt her anyway other than ridiculing and belittling her. And at that time that she's gathering the papers is when Edward Partridge and Charles Allen were being tarred and feathered, just kind of across the way, is when they were being stripped and tarred and feathered. And she was trying to focus on the papers, and he's like, look, even your bishops, you guys aren't going to get this unscathed. And this is where it's really, really, really cool too. And I apologize, I'm an incredibly emotional person, but I think this is cool. And he pointed out Edward Partridge. And as she looked up, she's on the ground gathering papers, and she looked up and looked at Edward Partridge and Charles Allen. And I want to say this as it was quoted. It says, as she looked over at Edward Partridge, walking away covered in tar and feathers, she said she saw a bright light surrounding him, brighter than the noonday sun, and exclaimed to herself, glory to God, for he will receive a glory of tar and feathers.
Wow.
She didn't say that to anybody, and that's significant later on as well, but she didn't say that to anybody other than the guy that was standing next to her. She just exclaimed that out loud. These men who had just been beaten, tarred and feathered, stripped, tarred and feathered, walking away, were just surrounded by this brightness. And Edward Partridge is known to have said, I have done nothing wrong. I will gladly suffer for my religion and my God.
Wow.
And she witnessed that. See, do you see how she is so much cooler and cooler and cooler than just these 4 verses?
I just don't understand how any of these people endured all of this stuff.
I don't either.
I stand all amazed, as Phelps said. I stand all amazed at them. Because, the tarring and feathering of Joseph and Sidney Rigdon was horrifying as well. And they said that Sidney Rigdon was never the same after that night that he was beaten. And so, again, I say we've got to go easy on some of these people that we think left the church. Yeah. They have their stories to tell. And, again, I'm so glad that I haven't been asked to go through that myself.
Agreed. Well, that tar and feathering, that whole incident happened on July 20th. And on July 23rd...
So that was just a month after she got there.
Yeah. But
Wow.
yet she was supposed to receive peace in Zion, right?
Oh,
So
I
you
see. Yeah.
yeah. So
Good
you
point.
see how, and she didn't. She was that scarred her emotionally to have to deal with that man. I don't know what all was said.
You know, and you have to remember too. Here, first of all, she's being threatened by an angry man,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't have 911 to call. They didn't have police that would respond instantly or try to help in a domestic situation. They're really out on their own.
Yeah, and she was 46, so she was 2 years younger than I am now. She was 46 years old, standing in the street in the summer. I'm sure it was hot and humid, and collecting these papers with all this chaos happening around her, and this man standing over her.
Wow.
Yeah.
Pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, and
but she kept going.
She kept going. She is really incredible. So just a couple days later is when the leaders of the church got together and they're like, all right, we're going to leave. And this is just church history, but I think it's important to note. July 23rd is when they signed the memorandum that, okay, half of us will be gone by January 1st and the rest will be gone by April 1st of 1834. Right? They signed the paper saying, we're going to leave us alone. Okay. So
can I interrupt you real quick?
Mm-hmm.
The governor of Missouri was Lilburn W. Boggs. And interestingly, way back, well, not way back, a couple years earlier, Peter Whitmer,
Mm-hmm.
one of the first missionaries out there to the West, when they were stopped from teaching the Indians, he spent his time there in Independence as a tailor.
Oh, that's right.
And he was a very, very good tailor. And Lilburn Boggs was one of his customers. In fact, Peter Whitmer made I guess we'll call it the tuxedo. I think they called it the inauguration suit for Lilburn Boggs when he was made lieutenant governor
Mm-hmm.
of Missouri. And then after the Saints were driven out, I don't know that you find this in those records there, but after the Saints were driven out, Governor Boggs lived in the city of Zion.
Yeah.
He lived in a home just a couple blocks from the temple site. I mean, it's just such crazy history in those days.
It is. There's a lot of crazy because here again,
And then he was nearly assassinated in that home too.
Boggs was?
Yeah,
Oh,
he was shot through the living room window, and they always claimed it was Porter Rockwell.
Good for him.
But he never was convicted of that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I'm sorry, go on.
No, you're fine.
But it's just crazy times. This should be a TV series.
It should be. It absolutely should be. Well, it's interesting because, like I said, they signed that memorandum and said, okay, we're going to go. We'll get out. Leave us alone. Well, Joseph Smith said, no. He said, don't abandon your property. Don't abandon your land. You legally purchased this land. You have a constitutional right to stay there. Now, I will say this. Was that Joseph Smith, the man, saying, no, you guys did this. We have a right to stay here? Or was that Joseph Smith, the prophet, saying, no, you guys need to stay here. This is Zion. I don't know. I don't know. But he's told them, he said, don't go. And on August 18th of 1833, he encouraged everyone to go to the governor for protection and to petition for protection, excuse me, as I stumble over my words. So he told everybody, he's like, don't leave. Go to the governor and ask him to stay. And maybe it's because of that association with Peter Whitmer that Joseph Smith felt that he could tell them to go to Governor Boggs for protection. Well, obviously none was given. And
it may have been a situation like Pontius Pilate,
mm-hmm.
where he didn't personally feel the need to persecute the saints, but politically, Pontius Pilate had to bow to the politics of the day. Maybe Governor Boggs wasn't such a bad guy. I don't know. He signed the proclamation.
Yeah,
I guess we should dig into Governor Boggs one of these days.
It could be an interesting, fascinating thing.
But anyway, it's very possible that was Joseph Smith's leadership speaking rather than his prophetic, the mantle of being a prophet, because they were always under the burden to act in their place.
Yes.
The Lord wasn't going to give them everything to say. And had that been a proclamation from the Lord, I probably would have ended up in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah. And
verily, verily, I say unto you.
Don't go anywhere.
Yeah. But they were doing the best they could.
They are. And
that's one of the things, I'm sorry, that's one of the things that created so much of the dissension in the early church and people calling Joseph a fallen prophet.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people made the mistake of thinking that because he's a prophet, every word that leaves his mouth comes straight from God.
Yes.
And I think there's a very important distinction between Joseph the man and Joseph the
Yep.
prophet. And I would say, admittedly, Joseph the man made some mistakes.
Yes.
We'll find that with the Kirtland Safety Society, the banking system, in which the whole United States banking system was collapsing. But again, the Lord doesn't command us in everything, and we do the best we can and assess. What's remarkable is that throughout all of this history that we're going to continue to go over here with you, the church keeps going, and it keeps growing, and here it is today, and growing faster than ever.
Yeah.
So the hand of the Lord is hard to recognize.
It is. It's very
really hard to recognize, and that's where you need the faith, which is probably why President Nelson says the time's going to come that unless you have your own testimony, you're not going to survive. He would say that because if you don't have your own spirit-born testimony, the things you're going to see and the things you're going to hear might not make sense or conform to your expectations. And then it's easy to blame somebody else. So we could blame the church. But I think the Lord comes through in the end. But that's why it's extraordinary that a woman like Vienna could just keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Could just keep going.
And
anyway,
she endured a lot. She was there when this happened. And I want to point out also, I mentioned how she gave the money to buy the land that the Kirtland Temple was built on.
Uh-huh.
She was not there when the Kirtland Temple was dedicated.
Where was she?
She moved on to Nauvoo.
Gee whiz.
So she wasn't even there for it. But she knew that, I don't want to say her responsibility, but she knew that this work was true. She knew that it needed to go forward. And so she sacrificed and then continued to live her life. She didn't leave on purpose. She was, part of this, she was getting over to Zion and all the other things that were going on. But she wasn't there when the Kirtland Temple was dedicated. She was not at that amazing day that we've read about.
Well, that shows humility too, because it's like, it would be tempting for some rich member of the church to say, here, I will give the money for this temple, expecting that when the temple was opened and dedicated, that I will be honored and recognized for the contribution.
I get a front row seat.
Yeah. Yep. She doesn't sound like the kind of woman who needed the front row seat or the recognition. In fact, she doesn't sound at all like a woman that needed the recognition, which is even more extraordinary. She was doing the right thing.
Yep. And that's exactly right. And again, those are some of the things with her. All of these things that have gone on, we'll see later as well, but she just wants to make sure the records are accurate. It's not about her. It's about church history, and it's about the progressing of the gospel and the building up of Zion. And it's not about her. Brent Rogers had to do a ton of research, and he had a lot more access to things, being part of the Joseph Smith papers. But
we probably had good access to the church archives and church history records.
Which I'm so grateful to him. And I actually was looking for his email or some way to reach out to him, and hopefully maybe he'll listen to this podcast. But I want to reach out to him, and I want to discuss with him more, because the way Vienna impressed on my heart when I read about her, I can't tell you anything else about Section 90, just that Vienna was mentioned in it. And I remember coming to you, because you are my scriptorian, you know everything about the scriptures, I swear, and asking you about her. And when you didn't know, I was like, how many times have I maybe read this before and just glazed right past her? How many people do that? I mean, we're about to study this. I'm curious to see what happens in Sunday school next Sunday.
If they even mention it.
If they even mention it. It's 4 verses.
Well, that's what I said at the very beginning of our discussion. I have been astounded by how there's so many little truth bombs dropped in the scriptures in 1 verse or 2 verses or 3 verses, and then you go on. I mentioned, again, and I don't mean to sidetrack as far, but in Alma 37, Alma 36 and Alma 37 are, I think, my favorite sections of the Book of Mormon. When Alma's talking to Helaman, and he's telling him the story of how the angel stopped him on the road with the sons of Messiah and all of that. And those 2 chapters are so rich. And in chapter 37, he's talking about the 24 gold plates to Helaman, which haven't been mentioned since way back in Mosiah. And then there's this one verse in which the Lord talks about his servant Gazalem,
Okay.
Gazelem, who is his servant. He says, my servant, and he made him a stone that would glow, a glowing stone, kind of like with the brother of Jared, and that this would reveal the truth to the people, revealing their wickedness and abominations. Boom, and then on we go. And not another word is mentioned about it. And you say, wait a minute, who was this guy? He was somebody that Alma knew of, because Alma talks about him, and he obviously was a servant of the Lord, and there's obviously a story to be told there with this glowing stone. And yet Mormon said, well, it's cool, but we need to move on, so I'm just going to bridge this right out. And yet there's this one little truth bomb right there in verse 23, I think it is, of Alma 37. And I love that, because what you're showing here today is in these 4 kind of obscure verses, there's a person behind that, and there's a life of sacrifice and endurance and enduring to the end. And unfortunately for her, she had a long end to endure, because she lived to be, 97 or something?
96, I believe.
Yeah, 96. It was in her 97th year.
Yeah.
So she had a long life to continue to endure. Anyway, we'll go on with that. These are points of the gospel that I feel we should keep in mind all the time. These aren't just names.
Yes.
W.W. Phelps did so many things. He spoke he delivered the eulogy for Joseph Smith, and yet he was excommunicated 3 times and came back. And he wrote, was it 20 or 23 hymns in the first hymn book? These are remarkable people who suffered greatly. And I hope to all the listeners out there that as you read about other people barely named, you'll stop and consider that there were lives lived under their names and experiences that we'll never comprehend.
Yeah.
So what more can you tell me about Vienna?
Well, I just want to, this one I want to point out, because again, March 18th of 33 is the revelation. April 30th, they say, we got to get her to Zion. June 7th, she arrives in Zion with William Hobarts. July 26th, the mobs, the crazy, the tar and feathering of Edward Partridge. July 23rd, they say, okay, we're going to leave. By April 1st of 1834, we'll be gone. Joseph Smith says, don't go. Petition the governor to keep your lands that you bought. And August 18th, he says that, and the governor's like, nah, we're not going to help you out. Well, then on October 21st of 1833, the state, Missouri, is like, no, we're done. We're done with these Mormons. We want them out again. And they came back and they started unroofing houses again and tearing things apart and whipping and beating men and actually molesting the women and just horrible things. And on November 14th, there was a battle. I don't know everything about the battle, but there was a big battle that at that point, November 4th, there was a battle. And the members were like, we're out. And Joseph Smith was like, get out. We need you to be safe and alive.
But what's interesting is that they'd already agreed to leave.
They'd agreed to leave. Then they asked to stay. They were told no. And then they were still probably going to leave on January 1st. But by November 5th, they gathered what they could and took off. It says that some people just grabbed their children and left. Others tried to grab some food and some clothing, whatever they could. But on November 5th, it says that they scattered in all directions. And they were just left. And that's kind of when Zion's camp came about, because they left. So now they're living destitute. Again, let's go from Vienna Jaques having 2 homes, one in Boston, one in Rhode Island, working 3 jobs, income-producing homes, a successful woman, to freezing in the winter and doing this.
And they had to say, where's God?
Yeah. She's like, I was promised.
Where's Joseph Smith as the prophet? What's going on?
Yeah.
This had to be beyond a test of faith.
Yeah. It from every account that Brent shares is that she kind of held on to her faith. she stayed pretty good. She was like, okay, it's okay. Like her testimony, whatever her vision was of the Book of Mormon, or that testimony that burned inside her kept her going through all of this. And we'll hear even more. But in Zion's camp, people got very sick. Cholera. There was a cholera outbreak because of the water, I believe. And she took care of a lot of the people. Her nursing skills took care of many of the sick people. She took care of Heber C. Kimball, nursed him back to health. And he writes very highly about her and the care that she gave him during that time, and all the people that she cared for. It appears as though she just cared for whoever was sick. She wasn't specific. It wasn't like, oh, I'll take care of the leadership of the church. It was, she took care of people. She helped with babies. She helped pregnancy, women's care, all the things. She just served with the knowledge that she had.
Just serve. Isn't that a program today?
Yep, just serve. Just serve. But so while in Zion's camp, I think she was there when the temple was dedicated on March 27th of 1836. I know we just jumped a few years, temple, but that's kind of what we got through. And she was not in attendance. Like we mentioned earlier, she was not in attendance of that, but she was still hearing. She would hear about the different things happening. And I believe there were 2 members, maybe of the First Presidency or the Quorum of the 12, that had been excommunicated. Maybe that was when Sidney Rigdon was excommunicated. No, because he was at the dedication.
That might have been the Johnson boys, Lyman Johnson and Luke Johnson.
Lyman sounds familiar to me.
Might have been them, yeah.
But as she's hearing the word of what, the reorganization of the leadership of the church due to whatever is going on, Vienna wrote more letters back home to whoever. It didn't say her mom came across, so maybe she's writing to her mom, her siblings, her friends, because I think there were a total of 6 kids, and her sister's the only one that's recorded as coming with her. Well, that's significant because these letters that she wrote home about to Essex County in Massachusetts, she wrote about the reorganization of the church. Well, Wilford Woodruff was proselyting back there, and one of the people he came across was a Mr. Burbanks. I don't remember hearing his name, but Mr. Burbanks was one of the recipients of Vienna's letters talking about the reorganizations of the leadership of the church. And he let Wilford Woodruff read the letter, and that's how Wilford found out about the new leadership in the church.
Really?
Because Vienna wrote a letter to a friend, and Wilford was proselyting, and Wilford came across with a friend. So these just little insignificant things. It's insane. In 1838, there was the Hans Mill Massacre, and she was not there. It said she was in a town 15 miles away. So she was not part of that Hans Mill Massacre, but that was, I believe, the main reason Joseph Smith went to Liberty Jail, because he was like, militiamen, that's when they sexually abused the women. There were 64 men and women arrested at that time, and Joseph Smith was like, leave them alone. Take me to jail. And that's when he spent all those months in Liberty Jail, was because of, I didn't know that, but it was because of the Hans Mill Massacre.
He and was it 6 friends or 5 friends?
I'm
5 or
sure.
6 of people that supported him.
Yeah. And
Sidney Rigdon, one of those, he got so sick that they released him early.
Oh, that's right.
They didn't want him to die in their jail.
Oh, that's right.
Didn't want his death on their hands. But the rest were freed by some very generous jailers when they were being transferred after that. But again, horrible. And yet, that Liberty Jail is now called the Temple Jail. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard that because of all the revelations and things that Joseph Smith received while there. It was incredible.
he said later on that he wouldn't have the knowledge he had if he hadn't been there.
Isn't that where he received the, if thou descendeth?
Yeah, 121, 122. Yeah. Oh God, where art thou?
Yeah. And he's like, all these things will be for your benefit, and the Son of Man.
But he says he received a lot about temples, and said he had time to ponder a lot of. Sitting in a miserable, stinking hole.
Oh man, I can't imagine.
Again, how do you have the faith to endure all that?
Yeah.
I just am amazed by that stuff.
Yeah. Well, in 1839, I believe Joseph Smith had gotten out of Liberty Jail at this time, and in May 7th of 1839, they were petitioning the state for restitution on the loss of their lands, the loss of their property.
This is Missouri.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so they were writing and saying, hey, this is what happened. Can we get restitution on this? Well, this is the 1800s and Vienna is a woman. This is the only known time that Vienna was married. We don't know when she got married. She married a gentleman named Daniel Shearer. He was a widow. He had one small son. He was 47 years old. Vienna was 51. And the only mention of it is because to petition the state, basically you had to be a man at the end of the day. And it talks about in this petition to the state to get restitution for their losses, Vienna was mentioned with Daniel, my wife. She lost, and they petitioned $250 in lieu of Vienna's property. Well, the total petition equaled almost $4,000. So Daniel was going to get, $4,000, and Vienna was going to get $250. But it sounds to me, and this is based upon what I've read and my understanding, it kind of sounds like she got married so that she could do this, because the marriage did not last long.
It was a financial arrangement.
That's kind of what it sounds like.
I can understand that. I can understand that. Out of desperation, you've got to do something.
Well, and again, she went from being quite wealthy and successful to having to ask the government for $250 because she lost everything. So I can understand being like, hey, we get married so that we can have, so that I can get something. They didn't have any children. She was 51. And we're really not even sure when it dissolved. It just was suddenly there. They kept going and he wasn't around. There is a record of him, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but that was in May 7th of 1839. And on October 29th, 1839, Joseph Smith and Higbee. Elias Higbee?
I think it was Elias.
I think it's Elias. Went to President Van Buren and said, hey, we are citizens of the United States. We've been in Missouri. This is what's happened to us. Can you please help us? We've lost almost $2 million at that time, $2 million worth of losses for our people. Will you please help us? And politics. No.
Yeah,
sorry. Good luck.
I feel your pain.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. So they didn't get any help from the government at that time either. Shocking. But back in Zion's camp, all of the cholera, and then as they're continuing on, now there's malaria due to all the mosquitoes. And Vienna took care of a bunch of people with malaria, trying to help them, heal them back to health. It doesn't ever say or mention anywhere that Vienna got sick. She helped people. She nursed people back to health. It doesn't ever say that she got cholera or malaria.
She must have been a tough woman.
Yeah. At 51 doing this, I'm 47. I want to retire from my comfy job sitting in front of my computer. And she's out doing this. So, okay, so we've already talked about all these cool things that she's done. This is probably one of my favorite things also.
Okay.
September of 1840. Let me back up just a teeny bit. August 15th of 1840. There was a gentleman that passed away by the name of Seymour Brunson. And Joseph Smith was at his funeral. And he spoke at his funeral. And at the funeral, Joseph Smith spoke about the ordinances that the dead would be able to have performed for them. And he talked about baptisms for the dead. Well, in attendance was a woman named Jane Harper Nyman, whose husband and son had passed away. Well, her husband had been baptized. Her son hadn't. And she was very concerned about the spiritual welfare of her son. And she wanted him to get baptized. And so she went and said, hey, Joseph Smith talked about this. I want to get baptized for my son. Can I do this? And so on September 12th of 1840, Jane Harper Nyman was baptized in the Mississippi River on behalf of her son.
Really? That's
cool. So that was the very first baptism for the dead that was performed. Well, Vienna heard that this was going to happen. So Vienna went. So Vienna was in attendance at the very first baptism for Jane Nyman's son.
You say the Mississippi or the Missouri River? What'd you say?
I thought it was the Mississippi River.
No, that was, I just didn't remember.
No, that's okay.
Mississippi River.
The Mississippi River. So again, here's Vienna, for lack of a better term, in the right place at the right time. She wasn't the one getting baptized. Nothing happened for her, but she got to witness the very first baptism of a mother for her son. And at that time, she got to do it for her little boy.
How cool.
She was a witness to that. And later, When Joseph Smith heard about it, he wanted to make sure it was done in the proper order, that it was done correctly. So he was asking what happened. He asked the elder who baptized her, and he asked Vienna. He did go to Vienna and said, hey, I heard you were there. Can you tell me how this baptism was performed? She told him, and Joseph Smith said, okay, that was done correctly. And because of that, it started this wave of baptisms for the dead. Everybody was like, wait a minute, I want my family members to be baptized. And they said that almost at any given time, there were 8 to 10 elders in the Mississippi River baptizing for the dead.
No kidding. Now, Shannon, were they in Nauvoo now? Because Nauvoo started in like 1839. It 1839 to 1840, and it was on the banks of the Mississippi River, and they were draining that swamp and all of that.
It is possible because afterwards, and I want to go through this, but afterwards Joseph said, okay, this needs to stop. This needs to be performed in the temple. And so they stopped. So yeah, I believe they were in Nauvoo.
Yeah, because that's right at the time that they were making the change. It took a while for people to get to Nauvoo. Yeah, it took a while to drain the swamp and build the town and
everything.
All of that too. That's another story we got to tell.
Yeah, there is. Well, it says that Vienna got on temple work. She loved it. She was so inspired by it. It says that she herself performed over 50 baptisms for the dead, both men and women of her family. And they said that during that time, there were approximately 6,000 people who were baptized in the Mississippi River for their deceased loved ones. Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool.
And it made national news because in 1841, they did a baptism. That's when George Washington was baptized. And when in April of 1841, William Henry Harrison had passed away, and they baptized both of them the Mississippi River during that time. So it made national news.
Yeah, Washington died in 1799. So Vienna Jaques was alive while he was alive.
Yep.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that had to be off of Nauvoo there.
Yeah, I believe it was Nauvoo because that was the summer of 1840. And on January 19th of 1841, Joseph Smith received the revelation. It was like, hey, guys, we need to do this in the temple. So these need to stop.
That was probably preceded by, hey, guys, the water's cold.
Potentially.
We had to break the ice.
Yeah. Now, they did get to continue. He said, these need to be performed in the house of the Lord. And we'll let you continue, but we need to do these in the house of the Lord. And so they did continue through 1841. It was October of 1841 when Joseph was like, no more. We need to stop. I've received revelation. It needs to stop. And so then the members went to work making sure that the font was built in the basement of the temple being built on the 12 oxen representing the 12 tribes of Israel.
I think that was the very first thing. Well, it makes sense underground, the first floor.
It is. They got that done, and they finished it November of 1841. It was dedicated and done while the temple's still being built around it, and the saints resumed baptisms for the dead
in
cool? The font with the temple being built around it.
Well, and that continued because I don't believe the temple was ever fully finished, but they did do baptisms in the font, and then up in what they called the attic is where they performed sealings. The temple marriages was up in the attic of the temple. Yeah. Those were the two priorities.
And Brigham Young talks about that a lot.
Okay.
So then there's not much else said about Vienna between 1841 and 1844 when Joseph Smith died. And obviously that just rocked the saints and shook their world. But she was in attendance at his funeral. She did get to see his body and Hiram's body as it was brought back to the mansion in Nauvoo. And just talks about what a hard time it was. There was rumor that Vienna was one of Joseph Smith's wives. It's very hard to find any proof on any of that. There are 3 accounts that Brent Rogers found that indicate she was, she wasn't, and maybe. So we don't know for sure if she was married to him in this life or not. From everything else that we have read and found and seen and whatnot, she was not married to him. She respected him. She did not like polygamy. It was something very hard for her to swallow. But it even does talk about how polygamy was not hey, you're all Mormons, go marry everybody.
Yeah.
It wasn't that. And they
Oh,
talk
no, it was
about
a very, very restricted practice.
very.
Now, it's possible, and I guess this would be in the area of speculation, it's possible that there was a acquiescence to the need to be sealed,
Yep, we're getting to that.
and so that she could have been married to Joseph in order to be sealed.
We're getting to that.
Okay, then I'll be quiet.
It's okay. Well, it talks about how for those couple of years there was that little bit of, I don't want to say chaos and confusion, but a little bit of, now what's going to happen? Joseph Smith is dead. Now what's happening?
Yeah.
Well, Vienna very much prescribed to the order of the church, and that through the prophet and the apostles, that was how the church was led. And so Brigham Young was the president of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, so she chose to follow him, as did most of the saints, is my understanding.
Sidney Rigdon was the other side of that. He wanted to break away. He thought it should be a patriarchal succession.
I remember that.
And that was the main division there. But it was not a clear-cut decision, because Joseph had never explained the succession of the church.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yes, which is very interesting. But I love how beautiful it is, because when you think about Christ's church, when he was on the earth, after he passed, essentially Peter took over.
Yeah.
And Peter wasn't his brother or anything else, but it's the more I've learned about that time when Jesus Christ walked the earth and the 12 apostles and all that they went through, the more I can see the incredible parallel of the church that we attend today, and the way that the
in fact,
gospel's set up.
you mentioned Peter, the first presidency, if you will, of the primitive church was Peter, James, and John.
Yep.
And James was Jesus's brother.
Yeah.
Or sometimes some Christians call him his half brother.
Yeah. Right.
But nevertheless, in a familial progression, you would have thought James would have been the one that they would. So anyway, Peter succeeded the Savior in the church, but having James in the presidency under Sidney Rigdon's thoughts, you would have said, well, James is going to be the successor in the church.
In 1846, Vienna chose to follow Brigham Young, and Brigham Young wanted to keep going with the temple work too. And so he had a huge push on the sealings, because Joseph Smith had talked about the sealing power and all that stuff. And it talks about in Brigham Young's diaries, talks about how he practically lived in the temple, and all he did was perform sealings, and he would maybe sleep for 4 hours a night and then spend the rest of his time in the temple.
Really?
Yeah, making sure that the saints, making sure that everybody that possible could get their endowment. And Vienna did get her endowment on January 22nd of 1846. She went to the temple and received all of her endowment.
Really?
Yep.
Now, I would have thought earlier, when Joseph was still alive, like 1843 or somewhere in there.
No.
Because they were doing endowments then. Yeah. They're doing sealings then.
Sealings. They were doing baptisms.
1846.
1846. And this is another indication of where she was divorced, because remember, it was 1839 that she petitioned with Daniel Shearer for restitution for the loss of stuff. But she received her endowment on January 22nd, 1846. Daniel received his on February 3rd, 1846.
So then did she leave with Brigham Young, or how'd she get to Salt Lake?
She actually left February of 1846. It was about 2 weeks after she received her endowment. She left to go to Salt Lake.
February of 1846?
Correct.
So did she go to winter quarters?
She had her own horse and buggy. She had her own stuff, and she headed out. It says 1846, and then just says not much is known about Vienna during winter quarters. So we don't know if.
Well, that's odd, because the Brigham Young didn't get to Salt Lake till July of 1847.
So she may have. I believe it says that they traveled for a time.
I would have thought she'd leave in February of 47.
This said 46.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We have to research that out some. Because what'd she do all of the year of 1846?
Well,
and all of that winter.
And she may have stopped at winter quarters, because it does mention winter quarters, and I maybe didn't write the notes well enough on that one, but where she did travel. She had her own horse and buggy. She took her own cattle car, whatever she had. She ran it herself. She didn't have a man with her at that time to do it. Daniel didn't go at that time. He stayed, I believe, for 5 more years in Jackson County, or in Nauvoo. And so she was on her own. Here she was being an independent woman again. But I believe it does mention that they did stop for a season because they didn't want to travel over the winter again. But she was in Charles C. Rich's company that got to Salt Lake City. She was one of the first 126 people to arrive in Salt Lake City. Oh, excuse me. She was one of the first 1,800 people to arrive in Salt Lake City. She arrived in a group of 126 people that were mostly women, but she was one of the first 1,800 people to arrive in Salt Lake City. Now, here's where, again, prominent, wealthy, 2 houses, many jobs in Boston, Rhode Island, came across, dealt with all the things in Kirtland and Nauvoo and everything else. When she got to Salt Lake City, she slept in her wagon for a year.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. She crawled up in the back of the wagon and slept there for about a year trying to make coverage. And finally, it was by October of 1848, it says, her wagon was so tattered and torn that it didn't really provide her much protection. And so at that time, she wrote a letter to Brigham Young. And she's like, hey, can I please have some land? Like, I've got everything ready. And even with this, living in the wagon, you know,
and
sold
she'd been
all of
promised
assets.
peace.
Yeah, promised peace, promised that she'd be taken care of. During her year in Salt Lake City, she had secured everything she needed to build the house once she got her land. So here she was, she's waiting, she's ready.
She just needed some land.
All she needed was some land. And so she was trying to be patient.
But what was the hang up there?
I think it was just getting everybody there, and I don't know for sure, but she wrote a letter to Brigham Young asking for a lot of land. He said, I need you to wait. And she wrote back and said, how much longer do I need to wait? And then she got a letter from William W. Phelps, that told her there was no land for her. He said, but you can come into my family and you can be one of my wives and I'll take care of you. And she said, no, thanks.
Really?
Yep. She said she was waiting and trusting on the prophet that she'd be taken care of.
Good heavens. And so, quick, tell us, did Brigham Young ever?
They finally did. There were 2 things with her land, I think just one. She wanted a big enough land that she could care for herself, till and take care of the land, and that it was close enough that she could walk to the house of the Lord. Those are the only 2 things she asked for.
Wow.
So we know, because we used to live in the area,
Yeah.
Salt Lake City was built like the city of Zion was supposed to be, with the temple in the middle, and then it all building out. And it goes into all of the land and the section outs and the blocks and everything else. But she did end up with a property, and I'm not sure, but I think it's 120th South 3rd Street is where she lived.
Okay, yeah.
It just
that
was kind
makes
of
walking to the temple
very easy.
reasonable.
Yep, she was really, I think it said a block and a half.
So kind of like 2nd East and 3rd South.
Yeah. And
First East, 3rd South.
It does say that no land in Salt Lake City was bought. It was all divvied up by the church and given.
Wow.
So she was given a land. It was in the 12th ward that was presided over by Bishop Hyde, who was somebody I believe that she had met back in Boston. And
are you talking Orson Hyde?
I'm going to have to find his name because I just remember.
But
he was somebody who I believe she had met in Boston, who is now the bishop of her. She was in the Salt Lake City 12th ward.
Wow.
Now her husband, or Daniel Shearer, did end up coming to Salt Lake City. He was actually in the 13th ward. So he was close by, but in a different ward. He did remarry, had a different wife. And but it says that Vienna went from Boston to Kirtland to Jackson County to Clay County to Caldwell County to Nauvoo to Winter Quarters and to Salt Lake City, where she finally found her peace that she was promised in the Doctrine and Covenants section 90.
Wow. And then she lived until what, 18?
Oh shoot, let me double check it so I get it right. 1884.
So she was born in 1787.
Correct.
And lived to 1884. Wow.
Correct. She
that's extraordinary to have lived, especially as a single woman, to live into your 90s. 96.
Yeah, she died February 7th of 1884, and her birthday is June 10th.
Wow, what a life.
Yeah.
What a life.
But in Salt Lake, she did some things in Salt Lake that I would like to point out as well. And we're
Tell
almost
us about
done.
Those.
I promise, because she's 60 years old at this point. In Salt Lake City, she was part of a female council of health. She participated and she shared her expertise on women's health and childcare and childbirth. And she was in all the reports of children being born at that time. There aren't many reports of doctors, they're all midwives. And Vienna attended to many, many, many of the births of the babies that were born in Salt Lake City after the saints arrived. In fact, there was a woman from New York who came over. Her husband was assigned to be the secretary of the Utah Territory by the U.S. government, Elizabeth Ferris. So she and her husband came over.
Not necessarily LDS.
They were not LDS, in fact. But they did come and they lived in Salt Lake. And Elizabeth was, interacted with the saints, and she talked to them. And she wrote letters about the Women's Society and about Vienna specifically. And to be honest, she mocked them mostly. She said that they were uneducated women just gathering together. But whenever she spoke about Vienna, and there was one particular letter that she did write about Vienna, for the most part, she was very respectful of Vienna, talking about how she was an educated and proper woman. Although she, instead of living and wearing the most fashionable clothing, she's a woman who lived in a wagon for a year. Yeah. She had much more modest clothing at the time, but she called her a curiosity. She insulted her and she praised her in these letters. This Elizabeth Ferris person did about Vienna. But Vienna seemed to not let anything rattle her, good or bad, with the exception of the day she was gathering the papers in the streets in Jackson County. For the most part, it doesn't seem like much rattled her.
Being a Relief Society president yourself, is there any mention of her interacting with the Relief Society?
Very much so, yeah.
Oh, okay.
She was never a president. Doesn't even mention she was ever in a presidency.
Sounds like she should have been.
Yeah.
Today she'd be the general
Relief Society president, yeah. Right? No, she was never, like I said, she was never any significant person of authority or office in the church. She just was this incredible woman. And in fact, in November of 1854, she was called to the church historian's office to give another account of that first baptism for the dead that Jane Nyman did for her son. They wanted to hear her side of the story so that they could make sure they had a complete picture.
That's cool.
She actually went there a few times to correct some records. And she did know she still had to be careful because she was still a woman in the 1800s, and even in Salt Lake, in the church surrounded by the saints, she still had to be careful with what she did. And at one point, she had her cow, and again, she's in her 60s now, and she had her cow, and her cow wasn't giving much milk. And so she wrote to Brigham Young and was like, "Hey, help. I need a cow that I can get milk from." He's like, "Well, you can get meat." She goes, "Yeah, but I need milk. I need to be able to survive off the milk. Can you help me?" And she actually offered to pay, I believe it was Brigham Young, to help her with the transaction, to broker a transaction to get her a cow that could give milk, because her cow was great for the meat, but it wasn't great for milk, and she wanted a cow with milk.
Wow.
But still, she had to go through, and there's some other situations that are just hard with men, but she very much stood up for herself with respect, and she would go to the church for kind of guidance and counsel and assistance, and whatever they said, she seemed to accept. And there was a situation with somebody who he did work for her, that she owed him money and he owed her money, and he was trying to get more money out of her than he should have gotten. So Vienna went and said, "Hey," and asked for help from the church. It took a little bit, but they finally looked at it and decided that he did overcharge her, but not by much, but they agreed on a number and she paid it without argument.
Wow.
And so just interesting. And then again, Vienna got her endowment in Nauvoo, but now she's in Salt Lake. And again, they've been talking about all the sealings. And Vienna was not married. Well, it keeps saying estranged husband. I don't know how divorce worked back then, but her estranged husband, all we know is she did not want to be sealed to Daniel. Daniel was remarried. Daniel didn't live far away. It doesn't talk about anything with their marriage, good or bad. She just didn't want to be sealed to him, but she did want to be sealed, and she wanted to be sealed to a righteous man. So she actually was sealed to Joseph Smith on March 28th of 1858.
No
She
kidding.
in the endowment house. Yep.
Wow. That's amazing.
And that's kind of where all the rumor about whether she was actually married to him in this life or not kind of comes in.
Yeah.
There is no clear record. There is no understanding. I would, based on everything I've learned about her and just my own impressions, I would say she was not one of his wives. She did write to him, and he did write to her. In fact, I found this letter that she received back in September of what year? Joseph Smith was still alive. 1833. In September of 1833, she arrived in Jackson County, and she received this letter from Joseph Smith saying, I have often felt a whispering since I received your letter like this. Joseph, thou art indebted to thy God for the offering of thy sister Vienna, which proved a savior of life as pertaining to thy pecuniary concerns. Therefore she should not be forgotten of thee, for the Lord hath done this, and thou shouldst remember her in all thy prayers, and also by the letter, for she oftentimes calleth on the Lord.
Amazing lady. Thank you very much for sharing that with us.
You're welcome. I do just want to tell you this really quick.
Go right ahead.
The two other things she did do in Salt Lake City, is that she heard the story about the tar and feathering of Edward Partridge, and she heard that somebody had made this big exclamation about this glorious stuff about Edward Partridge. And she went to the church historian's office and she said, okay, I just want to set the record straight. She goes, I didn't say this to anybody. These are the exact words I said. This is what happened. And so she corrected that record, not for her own glory, just so that it was told correctly. Obviously, somebody must have overheard her at that time, but she wanted to make sure that was taken care of correctly. And then there was a time, I don't know why this is significant, but it is, on April 2nd of 1867, she went to the church historian's office because they had a photograph of her, and she signed it that it was her.
Yeah, I've seen that photograph.
Yeah, I have too.
Wow.
So the only other thing I will say is, when you brought up the Indians and the blacks, is part of why we were getting so much flack. In 1867, the Relief Society was reorganized again in Salt Lake City, and there were, I think they said, 20 relief societies of Indian relief societies organized.
Wow, no kidding.
Where the saints would make clothing and provide food and all that other stuff for the Indian women to help them. And she just lived the rest of her life pretty much in peace, doing what she could. And there were a couple times, again, she was never a Relief Society president or anybody of leadership in the gospel, but she was asked to speak quite often. And most of the time when she spoke in Relief Society, she spoke about the power of prayer, how important prayer was, faith, temple work. She was a huge advocate of temple work, did temple work the rest of her life. I mean, living a block and a half essentially from the temple. And then she felt impressed to teach about the youth and how amazing they are and what they can do if they set their minds to it. And prayer, she was a big fan of, and prayer has always been something that has been important to me. I remember back in the gospel, when we did gospel in action when I was 11 years old in primary, prayer was one of the goals I set. And since that time, prayer has always been a big part of my life. And even just recently, President Holland, when he came back from his extreme illness and everything, I remember watching a clip where he talked about how when he got better, he felt the urge and the importance that President Jeffrey R. Holland, needs to pray more. And that just tells me.
I remember seeing that clip.
It was amazing.
Pray more often.
Yeah. And I'm like, wow. And here's Vienna is in 1867, 1874, 1876, all these recorded times, she talked mostly about prayer. And
forgive me for interrupting, but
fine.
you can, you've got to assume that as difficult as times were, and with the privation and the starvation and the lack of any type of luxuries, prayer was like your only solace.
Yeah.
And she'd lived enough of a life to see it in action, and so it was quite a faithful lesson that she was able to give to people.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is, in 1874, in her testimony, she shared that she found that prayer was most effective when she simply thought to ask for the things that she needed. That's when she found the most answers, I guess. But prayer, temple work, and the youth was pretty much how she spent the rest of her life, teaching and talking about the gospel.
Well, it's quite a life. Quite a
It
life
is
she
quite a
led.
life. There was an instance where Brigham Young, and I'm sorry I keep jumping back to these, I'm remembering them. Brigham Young asked for one of the letters that Joseph Smith wrote to her because he wanted his signature. And for some reason, she had given the letter after, they assume after Joseph Smith's martyrdom, to the church historian. But Brigham Young took his signature off that letter. Unsure why, maybe a keepsake, but he took his signature off Vienna's letter.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe someday there'll be a church film about her. That'd be an interesting thing. Well, thank you so much, Shannon, for sharing that with us. Quite a story over 5 verses.
Four.
Over 4 verses in the Doctrine and Covenants. That sounds like a good place to stop right there.
Well, we're at the very end.
All right.
Yeah.
I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to having you back. I have a feeling there's some other good subjects we touched on that we can maybe discuss in the future. But thank you for doing the research on this, and I hope that our listeners enjoyed it too.
Well,
anyway, I'm Mark Swint. I'm with Shannon Taylor. Thank you so much for listening to us, and we'll be back.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, there you go. Oh, and I'll see you next week. Folks, thanks for listening today. I sure enjoyed having a guest in the studio, and I hope that you found it enlightening and educational. I'm going to try to do more of these over the next little while. I want to do one on Martin Harris. I want to do early leaders of the church. In the meantime, have a great week, and thank you for listening.